Oftentimes, legendary genre busters don't get the acclaim they deserve until after the fact. That actually goes for both of the foremen of the Metroidvania genre. 1994's Super Metroid and 1997's Castlevania Symphony of the Night were both major innovators in the exploration adventure platformer genre that inspired a plethora of titles that would come after. The genre got its name by fusing the titles together. But Super Metroid, despite its critical success and how it's considered one of the best games of all time in current discourse, didn't really light the world on fire in the sales department, and that caused the series to go on an 8-year hiatus. Then, Symphony of the Night, the subject of this video, was also well received, but it had quite the steep climb to make to get the recognition it deserved. Because there were a lot of industry biases leaning heavily against Symphony before it was released. That was bias from the gaming press and even alleged bias from the company that owned the console it famously released on, Sony's PlayStation. So today I'm going to first tell the story of how this happened and why the table turned, and then give my thoughts on the game because I've never played it before. And this video series is about me playing the Castlevania games for the first time, so I'm here to deliver my thoughts on this iconic game. But before I even think about it, I wanted to highlight how I partnered with the website Frame a Game to bring you guys, the audience, a really cool offer. I always liked decorating my space in things that were authentic to me, but when moving into my new place, I wanted to try something different. Frame a Game is a site where you buy a frame for whatever purpose you want, be it a single game, a trilogy of games, 2 games, what have you. Games on different consoles, it's got everything. And the frame is custom made to your wants, and you put the game inside this plastic sleeve, and the disc goes on the disc holder. Underneath the game will be a plaque with whatever text you want, and then you mount it on the wall and it looks awesome. I did the trilogy set for Sly Cooper and then got a 4-game custom frame for Ratchet & Clank and Jak and Daxter. It looked even better than I was expecting, and lots of people have come over and said it looks great. If you use my link, you can get 10% off your order. I'm not being directly paid for this one, but I do get commission for every sale from my link, so if you think your gaming setup will be enhanced with this on the wall, consider checking it out. It's run by one guy in the UK, and I think he's got a really cool operation going. I was just buying these for myself and liked them so much that I wanted a collaboration, so thanks to him and his website for partnering with me. And now we can get back to your regularly scheduled programming. Before 1997, it was pretty clear how you were supposed to make a Castlevania game. Many of them had their own gimmicks that made them stand out, but Castlevania was typically a linear action platformer with extremely difficult levels. The team behind Symphony of the Night wanted to do something different. The project started its life as a Sega 32X game, but since that thing was a flop and a half, development shifted towards the unproven up-and-comer Sony's PlayStation, which made its debut in the mid-90s. Using CDs as its main format, which could be used to have more audio and full-motion videos. The hardware could also render 3D graphics in real time like never before seen. The game's assistant director, Koji Igarashi, wanted to do something different for this game because they noticed a trend of many previous Castlevania games in the bargain bin, which gave them the thought that the linear level approach to Castlevania didn't promote replay value or longevity and were more one and done. Personally, that surprised me since I think 2D linear action platformers are very replayable, but that's in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. So they looked elsewhere for what to do next. Their first thought was the Legend of Zelda series and how it created these long and complex dungeons where you run through many previous areas with new items to progress further. But they also wanted to maintain the side-scrolling hack-and-slash gameplay, which would make it a lot more like the Metroid series, so Super Metroid was also an influence on how to design the game they were trying to make. So essentially, Symphony of the Night would be another attempt at doing what Castlevania 2 was trying to do a decade earlier, only with the benefit of hindsight and modern technology to design it better than that game, which was actually how they pitched it to Konami. But finding inspiration and getting it approved internally was just one thing. There was a whole other issue holding this game back. The intent was for it to be a 2D sprite-based platformer, but this was the mid to late 90s and that was just not in style anymore. Like I just said a moment ago, one of the key selling points of the PlayStation was its ability to do fully 3D rendered polygonal graphics. Games like Resident Evil or Crash Bandicoot or Tomb Raider or Metal Gear Solid. Games that pushed the boundary of animation and cinematics in games and evolved past genres by putting them in the third dimension. These were the exciting new hot games people wanted to play. Which means on the flip side, 2D sprite-based platformers, which were the majority of video games prior to the mid-90s, were now considered old and thus not cool or worth promoting or playing anymore. And I'm not saying every person felt that way, just that it was the attitude of the era. Games were expanding so much that all eyes were on new technologies, not on things that would look old. Gamers didn't begin to have nostalgia for older titles until the late 2000s. What is known about PlayStation around this time is that the president of the American division, the late Bernie Stolar, had a policy that 2D games wouldn't release on PlayStation because he thought the PlayStation brand was best associated with the prestigious 3D games that made the console look cutting edge, and not have any perceivably old games on it. I covered this in my video on Mega Man 8 from 2024, when I said that Capcom, the owner of Mega Man, had to threaten to not release Resident Evil 2 on PS1 in order to get 2D games like Mega Man 8 and Mega Man X4 on the console. Allegedly, the story is the same for Symphony of the Night. Konami had to threaten to pull Metal Gear Solid from PlayStation in order to get Symphony of the Night on the console, and obviously Sony wanted MGS since it was exactly the kind of game they wanted the PS1 to be known for. So they allowed Symphony of the Night to release in the West on the PlayStation. I say allegedly because I couldn't find anything to back that up beyond a single Facebook post, but since we do know that Sony of America did have an anti-2D game policy, and we do know for a fact that this happened to Mega Man 8 and X4, which came out at the same time as Symphony of the Night, I'm inclined to believe it. What we do know for a fact is that the marketing departments had very little faith in this game, since it was not given a big promotion budget and didn't sell very well when it first came out, and got this kinda lame US box art where it's just a picture of the castle, when the other regions got these beautifully drawn illustrations. I know it's hard to imagine this happening now, since we live in an age dominated by nostalgia, but it was just not like that for gaming in the 90s. The press was also more generous towards games that pushed the envelope. Symphony of the Night came out around the same time as another Castlevania game on the Nintendo 64. It was titled Castlevania, but is better known as Castlevania 64. There's an infamous magazine article on how everyone should go play Castlevania 64, which has amazing 3D graphics and gameplay, unlike that PS1, which has an old side-scroller. Who would want to play that, am I right? That article in particular was so indicative of where the games market in the US was at the time, but it's also funny because of how dated it is. In truth, a sick game will always stand the test of time. Castlevania 64's legacy is one of a janky early 3D mess that played like ass and is held up like shit. I haven't played it yet, so I reserve all judgment until I do, but that game's legacy isn't a good one because of the very thing that once made it seem so glamorous. Symphony of the Night, while not selling that well when it came out, is now regarded as one of the best games ever, and as I said, is equally as iconic as Super Metroid in cementing the tropes and conventions of the Metroidvania genre. I've said in past videos that I'm not really a big Metroidvania fan. I've played most every Metroid game and think they're all really good and innovative games worthy of their flowers, I just don't feel any attachment towards them. But I still was really excited to try Symphony of the Night for this video because a title as iconic as this is more or less required playing for the video game history enthusiast. I wasn't sure how I was going to structure this video, so I just loaded the game up, took notes as I played, and figured I'd make it like my videos on many of the other Castlevania games and comment on my experience as I played through it and make my blind impression with it the video. So, without further ado, let's begin. The game actually is a direct sequel to Rondo of Blood, which was my previous Castlevania video, a game that didn't properly release in the US until after this game. But regardless, Rondo ended with Richter Belmont killing Dracula and saving the day alongside Maria Renard. Symphony's Prologue is actually a playable recreation of Rondo's final boss, though obviously not nearly as difficult. Shit took me like 40 minutes to beat in Rondo, but you'll clear it here in like first try, it being the first boss and all. They do that flashback to establish the setting and then tell us that it's been 4 years since then and Richter has mysteriously gone missing. Maria tries to find him, and at that same time, Dracula's castle is back, which is a good place to start looking. The game's true protagonist is also here, Dracula's son, Alucard. Despite his appearance, it's the same Alucard that fought alongside Trevor Belmont in Castlevania 3. He's once again here to squash whatever evil uprising his father's trying to pull and meets Maria as they try and find Richter and stop Dracula. Symphony of the Night redesigned many of the characters and created a new standard for Castlevania art design, as this game brought on the artist Ayami Kojima, who had never worked in games before this, but the work really speaks for itself. Previous Castlevania protagonists were almost always the He-Man type character design, which certainly works for what Castlevania is, but I also think these more elegant designs really stand out. While the art and visuals would certainly lead one to think this was a super serious game, it doesn't watch like one if you're playing it on the PlayStation 1. That's thanks to the infamous voice acting. Symphony is one of the many victims of how games made in the mid-90s wanted to use the CDs to add voice acting to the games, but most titles, especially ones made in Japan, just had these abysmal English dubs that were so bad and funny that it circles back around to being fun to watch. Dracula's back and forth with Richter in the Prologue being the most notorious example.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh. I was called here by humans who wish to pay me tribute.
Tribute? You steal men's souls and make them your slaves.
Perhaps the same could be said of all religions.
Your words are as empty as your soul. Mankind ill needs a savior such as you.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. Have at you!
But anyway, the entire game is littered with this awful porno acting, but it certainly was entertaining. And I can't be the only person who played this and thought Alucard kinda sounded like a Ron Perlman impressionist, right? You know, the guy who, among a bunch of other things, voiced Slade on Teen Titans. I had to think about it for a second, but Alucard sounded like the voice Ron Perlman used as Orion in Superman the Animated Series.
I can't believe you let that buffoon manipulate you. You'd never see me at one of these museum openings.
No time for small talk. Is the person who controlled you in that castle over there?
Maybe I was the only person who thought that? That's what came to my mind in Alucard's first voiced scene. If you want to take the story slightly more seriously, the PSP remake of Rondo of Blood came with new English versions of the original Rondo and Symphony of the Night. These two emulations of those games made up the collection released on PS4, and only on PS4, I'm afraid. But in the new Symphony, there's a more accurate script to the original text, and Alucard is voiced by the iconic Yuri Lowenthal. But I was fine with just playing the PS1 version. These opening rooms are doing the Metroid Prime thing where you start out decently powered up, and then Alucard reaches death, who takes all your gear and spells and everything away, so you start with nothing but your bare fists. If you've played the previous Castlevania games, there will be elements from the combat that feel familiar, but a lot of the game's mechanics are very new. For example, Alucard doesn't attack with a whip, so the most basic component of the series is out in favor of Alucard using a variety of different weapons. As I just said, he starts with his bare hands, and you'll unlock a short-range sword not long after. The way items work in this is that Alucard can equip weapons to either his left or right hand. One is used by pressing the square button and the other is by pressing circle. So you have to use two different weapons for different purposes, since some weapons have more range and speed than the others. Or you could use a shield with one hand and a weapon with the other. Some weapons will be two-handed and slow but have more range and power. It's a pretty basic combat system, but that makes it easy to pick up and play, while also giving you some things to experiment with and see what you like the most. I usually had a shield equipped, not really for defensive purposes, but more for movement. Alucard goes at jogging speed throughout the game, and if you want him to pick up the pace, you can use his dash maneuver. This was meant for defense, as the dash brings you backwards, but mashing the dash button is actually faster than running, so you stand opposite of the direction you want to go and dash in that direction. But if you have a shield, using the shield to cancel the dash mid-animation makes you go even faster for some reason. But it's not just what equipment you hold that's customizable. You can also find different clothes and sunglasses and armor to use on Alucard, which all have different stats as well. But mercifully, the stat effect screen is easy to look at and understand, so you won't really need to be in the menu for a super long time. What really boosted the combat in hindsight was how good the audio-visual element in this game is. The effects are really colorful and well drawn, making them fun to look at, and the sound effects of killing enemies are really crunchy and cathartic, making the combat loop really fun to engage with even if it's mechanically simplistic. Although that makes it sound like I found the game easy, which I did, past a certain point, but we'll get to that later. In my first session, I was kinda doing well, but the first boss with these two enemies working together, I will admit, it was kinda kicking my butt. But with each attempt, I started to realize I was almost trying too hard. Like, if you just avoid attacks and get hits in when you can, it's actually pretty easy. Which I would say goes for a majority of combat encounters in this game. What really tipped the scales back in my favor was the sub-weapons. This works exactly like it has in all the previous games. You hold up and attack and you use your sub-weapon, be it the dagger or the axe or the stopwatch or the book that spins all around you. Or some new ones like this one that bounces off the walls and does continuous damage. But of course, the holy water remains king. This has always been the greatest sub-weapon in Castlevania since the very first game, and that fact remains in Symphony. You toss it and any enemy caught by the fire gets damaged by the frame, making most every foe utterly helpless. In the early game, this was the go-to strat. When I ran out of hearts, which are still the sub-weapon ammo, I had no problems because enough damage had been done that the sword was basically cleanup. What I wrote in the notes for Session 1 was that the level design was decent, but really thinking about it, the early game wasn't doing anything super amazing in that department. One of the first major levels is an alchemy lab, and you progress to a library that also houses the game's shop system. You need to go here to buy an ability called the Jewel of Open that gets you through certain magic doors. And you can also buy gear and sell gear here as well in exchange for currency, and can buy library cards which take you back to this exact room. Which is one way to fast travel, and the other way is in these dedicated fast travel rooms. But as I've been hyping up, this game took a much different approach to exploring Dracula's castle than the previous games, since it's all one big interconnected map you can freely explore instead of individual linear levels like the previous games. But yeah, the lab and the library and the trek between them didn't really do anything so interesting I needed to write it down. But what I did need to write down was how the levels I was playing were boosted in quality by the presentation. I already talked up the visual and sound effects, but the sprite quality and artwork is fantastic in this game. Like I said about both Mega Man 8 and X4, the PS1's ability to do sprite-based games was kind of underrated given how most every game on the console focused on 3D graphics. But the 2D games on it almost always looked really impressive compared to what previous generations could do. And to say this game had great music would be the understatement of the century. This series has had really fantastic sound since the very first game, but Symphony is probably my favorite yet. The tracks all have a grandiose and epic quality to them, fitting for the setting. However, they strike the right balance where atmospheric tracks are there, and no track is so intense or bombastic as to get annoying or repetitive if you're exploring the same areas again and again. Just an amazing score from top to bottom. The Saturn version had exclusive tracks, like a remix of Bloody Tears from Castlevania 2, so there's that. It also has some exclusive areas, but according to my good buddy Retropolis Zone, those exclusive areas are shit anyway, and I wasn't missing anything by not playing them. So that's just what I'll do! The wiki also says the load times are longer, the transparency effects don't exist, and the Saturn version stretches the image to fit the resolution and had other performance issues that led to this version being denounced by Igarashi. It was also Japanese exclusive, so if you play in English, the extra levels aren't even worth emulating even if they were good, because you couldn't read any of the text. But with that said, we can get back to the main game. After the library, you need to go back to this underground area. To get in, you need to open these red floors, but the switch to do so is in a room you can only get into with the Jewel of Open. My needing to open these floors is when I stopped playing in Session 1 and picked up there in Session 2. The first thing that happened then was my going through a tower section where I was admittedly getting my butt kicked again. That was because flying enemies were surrounding me and I was trying to adjust to the timing of hitting them. But in my quest to hit the switch to open the red floors, I actually ended up on quite an interesting scavenger hunt for items. Like, I went back through the lab with the Jewel of Open so I could reach the cathedral to reach the central keep, which hides the Leap Stone. If you couldn't tell by the name, the Leap Stone lets you double jump. The utility of which should be pretty obvious, so it was a must-have. It was around this time where I was starting to get a better grasp on fighting enemies and was leveling up somewhat often. Level ups increase your stats and your HP and maximum heart capacity, so that gave me more holy water ammo. In this central clock room, the statue on the left moves every minute or so, and that led me to the Colosseum where Alucard meets Richter for the first time, who is seemingly aiding Dracula now. But he just sicks 2 enemies on you, and it was here where I was like, okay, I think I need a more powerful weapon because the swords I had were not cutting it and I barely beat this part. But I didn't have time to worry about that yet because I wasn't here for that. This area houses the Soul of Mist transformation, which you can use back in the library after a hidden mini-boss to unlock the Soul of Bat transformation. Alucard can transform into various animals, but the Soul of Mist and the Soul of Bat are the really important ones as they help with traversal and item collecting. It's really awkward though because the game does not explain how to use abilities at all. The Soul of Mist, for example, was very cumbersome to activate. It's used to phase through solid walls, but sometimes I'd accidentally activate the Soul of Bat trying to use it on multiple occasions. But yeah, the button combinations won't be given to you by the game, which I thought was slightly irksome. Like, I had to look up how they used the Bat's dash maneuver, which really sped things up once I figured it out. But what was good was how my prayers for a stronger weapon were answered not long after I got the Soul of Bat, because then I just accidentally pushed a bookcase in which stored the Holy Rod behind it. The weapon functions the same as a sword, but the hitbox felt bigger and the speed felt higher too. This, combined with the Holy Water, had me like, oh man, those ghouls are in trouble now. As I was then ripping and tearing through foes like there was no tomorrow. By using the Soul of Bat, I flew up the central path in the clock to get rewarded with the gravity boots, which Alucard can use to leap really high up. I read online that the gravity boots could be used infinitely when trying to reach a very high ceiling, which I couldn't get a grip on in my second session, but I was able to in the cavern on my third session. But either way, I used the gravity boots to reach this boss fight that came with 2 phases that was guarding the Echo of Bat, the use for which I couldn't tell at first, but the answer is that in pitch black areas you can see in the dark in bat form, which makes sense given the name of it, but it's a pretty situational power. In Session 3, I finally made it to the cavern with the red ground opening. Like I said, I started Session 2 with the intention of getting in here, but went on a massive item tangent instead, and I'm glad I did because let's be real, I probably was going to get my keister royally kicked. Instead, the cavern felt like a pretty simple section, all things considered. There was one boss around this point in the game where there's a fake save room that turns into a nightmare sequence with Alucard reliving his mother's death. That was pretty neat. But all the bosses are neat visual spectacles, in fact. Like this one that's a huge ball of bodies that fly off from the main thing with each hit and they become separate enemies for you to deal with. I thought it was all very cool. I was really enjoying the game around this point. Alucard was just a cool character to play as with the long hair and the dark cloak and the variety of weapons and spells to use. The visuals and music were a joy to experience, so I was having a lot of fun. I just thought it was all really satisfying, to the point where I was wondering to myself if I enjoyed this more or less than Super Metroid. I haven't played Super Metroid in like 5 years or something, so I might be due for a revisit at some point, but when trying to think about these two games critically, Super Metroid, for me at least, had less aura while playing. Don't get me wrong, the game certainly had aura, but the gothic setting and everything that went alongside it in Symphony of the Night just felt a lot cooler to me than Super Metroid. When I look at the game's design, I certainly feel like Super Metroid was doing a lot more with its world design and puzzles and environmental storytelling and platforming challenges and skill-based speedrunning opportunities than Symphony. Symphony is more easily broken in the player's favor, which I found incredibly satisfying since that's the kind of gameplay experience I enjoy the most, but I do think Super Metroid is the better game because I feel like every level in Super Metroid had a lot of challenges in them that stand out in my mind even years later. When even just a week or so after playing this game, I'm glad I took notes and could review the footage since many areas kind of bled together in my mind since I wasn't doing much besides running through and kicking ass. Which I did enjoy, don't get me wrong. But when debating which of the two genre titans I thought was better, I have an answer for which felt more satisfying in the moment-to-moment gameplay and then which one was better designed. It doesn't help that some really stupid antics happened not long after this in my playthrough. What needed to happen next was meeting up with Maria, which can only be done with the gold and silver rings. The gold ring is in the underground, and you get the silver ring by combining many of your powers to meet Maria on the left side of the tower. But if you use the gold and silver rings in the clock, it'll open a secret floor where you meet Maria again and she gives you the holy glasses, which will be important in a moment. Some might find needing to figure out how to use the rings in the clock room to be obtuse, but luckily I already knew that beforehand. After that, you need to reach the castle keep and can optionally take the clock tower to get there. I only bring that up because it was pretty cool how this was the same clock tower from Rondo of Blood. Alucard tells Maria early on that the castle won't be how she remembers it exactly because whenever the castle rises up again, it takes on a new form, which is a cool in-universe explanation for why Castlevania is different every time we play it. It's magic, not because Dracula hired a new architect every 100 years. But it was cool to see that this level was intact from the most recent version of the castle. Anyway, Richter is waiting for us in the keep, and this was the stupid antic I was talking about. Of course, the man is being mind-controlled, and if you fight and kill him, and the game ends here, and that's the bad ending. But if you have the holy glasses equipped, you'll see the mind controller, and if you kill that, then the game continues. What an idiot I would have been for my inability to predict that, had I not been warned of it beforehand. That was a little wordier than the usual catchphrase, but still. Super Metroid never did anything crazy or random like that, so points to that game. In the canon version of the story, Richter is saved and reunited with Maria, as Alucard tells them to get out while they can and he'll take care of the rest. An upside-down version of Dracula's castle appears from out of the sky apropos of nothing, and Alucard sets off for that, which is where the final act of the game takes place. I wasn't sure what to expect when I got here, because I got my ass beat pretty hard by this one vertical room that's littered with flying enemies, but I eventually reached the top, and at first I was like, oh god, is the game going to become Kaizo difficult now? But no, it doesn't. That room was just weirdly designed. Instead, the inverted castle is just the same game more or less, but the levels are now upside down and the enemies are tougher. That's probably reductive to say, but the finale went by in a blur in my mind because of what I did almost immediately after getting here. In this one room, there's a flying head enemy that has like a 1 in 500 chance of dropping a sword called the Chrysogrim. Apparently it was some super OP weapon and I was like, where do I sign? I grinded this enemy for maybe 20 minutes because I wanted whatever weapon it was. And I actually got it, and it didn't disappoint because I quickly became hysterically OP. This is a weapon you can use on the run, which is good enough on its own, but one press of the square button and you unleash a flurry of sword swings that do massive damage. You can just spam the button and literally nothing stands a chance against me. And the grinding also caused me to go up by several levels. But there are many ways of becoming OP at the end. RZ told me that if you use the Alucard shield, you can basically become invincible, but I didn't even need to do that because this sword was so hilariously unstoppable. Again, I'm not even complaining, I was overjoyed at the pixelated destruction I was causing. The goal of the endgame is to collect the body of Vlad a la Castlevania 2, but all I had to do was show up and kill the bosses in less than 10 seconds each. You bring the body parts to the upside-down clock room and that will unlock Dracula's chamber. As I'm sure you can imagine, I cleared Dracula and his right-hand man in a very short amount of time. Throughout the game and now at the end, Alucard is encouraged to think about humans and if maybe they're villains too. Dracula points out that it's humans in a cult who resurrect him every 100 years, which is something we saw in the opening cutscene of Rondo of Blood, meaning that humans are perhaps maybe as responsible for the cycle between them and Dracula as Dracula himself. Plus, there's the fact that Alucard's mother, a human, was murdered for having a child with Dracula, which gives Alucard angst against the human race, but he ultimately uses his mother's compassion as fuel to fight against the darkness his father unleashes and will continue to do so, ending Symphony of the Night. Though I actually only got the second best ending. If you explore at least 196% of the map, you get the best ending, but I only saw like 114%, so sucks to be me, I guess. But that was my experience playing Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I wasn't really sure what I was going to think of this game when I started playing it. I hoped I'd enjoy it, and not have any hot takes or whatever, and I'm glad to say that came true. I really enjoyed my time with this game and can definitely see myself coming back to it sometime in the future and getting full completion and perhaps the best ending. Symphony of the Night deserves all its flowers as an iconic genre-defining game. I was glad to be able to experience such a legendary title blind and have fun with it. This isn't exactly a favorite game of mine, but I thought it was really good and well worth playing. Paradoxically, I feel like the more open-ended a game is, the less I have to say about it in the moment-to-moment gameplay, compared to a linear game where I usually have something to say about every moment, but that's just the quirk of me as a game player and writer. Symphony of the Night, despite not getting the praise it deserved when it came out, obviously had enormously positive effects in the series. Almost every Castlevania game that followed Symphony followed its formula and iterated upon it. We still got classic-styled Castlevania every now and again, as well as fully 3D games, but Symphony became the gold standard of the series. Speaking of 3D games though, I mentioned earlier that Symphony was treated poorly in the press compared to Castlevania 64, which came out at the same time. It's easy to look at this as ridiculous now, given the legacies of these titles, but it personally made me feel really curious about 64 and wanting to try it. So that's what my next video will be. I'm going to play Castlevania 64 and find out if it's that bad. Maybe I'll think it's a diamond in the rough, or I'll have the next hilarious negative review on my hands. Either way, I'm excited to try it and see what I think. In the meantime, that's about all the time we have for today, so I'll close by saying that if you made it this far in the video, I thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.